My husband left a letter for me and told me one thing before he died. Don't open it until 6 years after my death. Today, after 6 long years, I finally opened it. And what I read inside that letter shocked me so deeply, I couldn't even speak for a moment. But before I tell you what was written inside, please subscribe to the channel, because more emotional stories like this are coming soon. And tell me in the comments, would you really wait 6 years to open something like this? Now let's begin. My name is Margaret Whitaker, and last summer I turned 76 years old. Now most folks say that once you reach 76, life ought to slow down a little. You drink your coffee slower, you sit on the porch more, and you stop chasing trouble. Well, that was the plan. But life has a way of changing the rules when you least expect it. I live in a small town called Cedar Ridge, Missouri, a quiet farming town where the biggest excitement most weeks is the Friday night football game or the church bake sale. My house sits at the end of a gravel road called Maple Hollow Lane. It's a white farmhouse with a long wooden porch and wind chimes that rattle every time the breeze moves through the oak trees. My late husband Frank Whitaker built the house himself back in the early 80s, hammering every board with those big steady hands of his. For more than 4 decades, that house was our entire world. Frank grew tomatoes behind the barn every summer. I baked peach cobbler every Sunday afternoon. And every fall we argued about football while raking leaves in the yard. It wasn't a fancy life, but it was a good one. Or at least, I believed it was. Frank passed away on a Thursday morning in late October 6 years ago. The doctor said it was heart failure. Frank had always been a strong man. Broad shoulders, rough hands, and the kind of laugh that made other people laugh, even if they didn't know the joke. But the last year of his life, something had changed. It started with little things. Frank stopped humming while he worked in the garage. He started checking the locks on the doors every night before bed. Twice sometimes. A few nights I woke up and found him sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, just staring out the window toward the barn like he was waiting for something. When I asked what he was doing, he would shrug and say, Maggie, it's nothing. Old man thoughts. After 40 years of marriage, you learn when to ask questions and when to let silence sit. So I let it sit. But 2 weeks before Frank died, something happened that I didn't understand until years later. It was a Sunday evening. We had just finished dinner. Pot roast, green beans, and mashed potatoes. Frank's favorite meal in the whole world. The television was playing an old western in the living room. Frank reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small brown envelope. He slid it across the table toward me. Maggie, he said quietly, I need you to promise me something. That alone made me nervous. Frank wasn't the dramatic type. What is it? I asked. He tapped the envelope. Put this somewhere safe. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. All right, I said. What's in it? He shook his head. Doesn't matter right now. Then he looked straight at me. And don't open it. I laughed a little. Well, that's just cruel, Frank. But he didn't laugh back. He said slowly, not for 6 years. 6 years. Such a strange number. I almost asked him why, but something in his eyes stopped me. So I nodded. All right, I said. I promise. Frank leaned back in his chair and let out a breath like he'd been carrying a heavy load. Good, he said softly. Then he asked if there was any apple pie left. That was the last normal evening we ever had. 2 weeks later, Frank collapsed in the garage. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was already gone. The entire town came to the funeral. My neighbor Doris Bennett brought 3 casseroles and a pie. The pastor talked about how dependable Frank had always been. And Frank's son from his first marriage, Travis Whitaker, flew in from Phoenix, Arizona. Travis and I had always gotten along well enough. Not close exactly, but respectful. He gave a short speech at the service about how his father taught him the value of hard work. After the funeral, Travis stayed at the house for 3 days. During that time, he spent a lot of time in Frank's workshop behind the barn. At the time, I figured he was just remembering his dad, looking through old tools, fishing gear, boxes of paperwork. Grief makes people behave in strange ways. You don't question much. But when I look back now, there were small things that didn't feel quite right. The way Travis asked if Frank had updated his will. The way his wife Shannon walked around the property slowly, like she was studying the land. And the way Travis asked twice about the north field behind the barn. Did Dad ever mention selling it? He asked. I told him no, because Frank never had. At least not to me. After Travis went back to Arizona, life slowly settled down again. I spent mornings in the garden, afternoons reading on the porch, evenings watching old movies, and most nights I had company. Not people, just my old golden retriever Charlie. Charlie had been Frank's dog originally, a big lazy fellow who liked sleeping under the kitchen table and following me around the house like a shadow. That dog kept me from feeling lonely more times than I can count. The envelope Frank gave me stayed in a cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I never opened it. Promise is a promise. Years pass faster than I expected. One season folded into the next. Spring gardens, summer thunderstorms, autumn leaves, then winter again. Before I knew it, the calendar on my wall read March 14th. Exactly 6 years since Frank handed me that envelope. That morning I made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. Charlie was stretched out nearby on the floor, snoring softly like old dogs do. My hands were shaking a little when I opened the cedar chest and took the envelope out. It looked exactly the same. Plain brown paper. Frank's handwriting across the front said only 2 words. For Maggie. I sat there staring at it for a long time, because once you open something like that, there's no putting the mystery back inside. Finally, I slid my finger under the flap. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper. Frank's handwriting filled the page. I read the first line and felt my stomach drop. It said, Margaret, if you're reading this, then something happened to me sooner than it should have. My heart started pounding. I kept reading, and then I saw the sentence that made my hands go cold. Frank had written, my death may not have been natural. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. The clock ticked on the wall. Charlie shifted in his sleep on the floor beside the table, letting out a slow dog sigh. Outside, a pickup truck drove past on Maple Hollow Lane like it was any ordinary morning. But nothing about that moment felt ordinary anymore. Frank's letter ended with one final line. A line that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He wrote, there is something hidden in the barn workshop, beneath the floorboards. For 6 years I believed my husband died of heart failure. But sitting there at the kitchen table, holding that letter in my hands, I realized Frank had spent his final days preparing me for something he never had time to explain. And whatever he hid under that workshop floor, he believed it mattered enough to wait 6 full years before I discovered it. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't realized before. Frank hadn't just left me a letter. He had left me a truth buried in my own backyard. And whether I was ready or not, that truth was waiting in the barn. I didn't go to the barn right away. That might surprise you. Most people in those crime shows run straight toward the mystery like it's some kind of treasure hunt. But when you're 76 years old, you learn something important about trouble. You don't rush toward it. You sit still first. You breathe. And you think. So that morning I stayed at the kitchen table with Frank's letter in my hands for nearly an hour. Charlie, my old golden retriever, eventually woke up, stretched his legs, and wandered over to rest his big head on my knee. Dogs always seem to know when something isn't right. I scratched behind his ears and looked back at the letter. Frank had never been the type of man to exaggerate. If he wrote those words, he believed them. And if he believed them, then something had scared him badly enough to hide evidence under the barn floor. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my sweater pocket. Then I stood up. My legs felt a little shaky, but not from fear exactly. It felt more like the moment before stepping onto a frozen lake. You're not sure if the ice will hold, but you step anyway. The barn sat about 50 yards behind the house. Frank had built it the same year he built the farmhouse. Red paint, white trim, and a roof that creaked every time the wind rolled through Cedar Ridge. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked across the yard. The morning air smelled like wet soil and fresh grass. Everything looked perfectly normal. That almost made it worse. Charlie trotted beside me like he always did, tail wagging slowly. When I reached the barn door, I paused. For the first time in years, I noticed something strange. Frank had installed a new padlock on the barn door sometime before he died. I remembered asking him about it back then. He had shrugged and said, "Just being careful." At the time I thought nothing of it. But standing there now, it didn't feel like a small thing anymore. I pulled the key ring from my pocket and unlocked the door. The metal latch clicked open with a dull sound. For a moment I just stood there. Then I pushed the door open. The barn smelled exactly the same as it always had. Old wood, motor oil, dust. Frank's workshop sat along the back wall just like before. A long wooden workbench, shelves full of tools, jars of nails and screws. His old radio still sitting on the corner of the table. Seeing that radio hit me harder than I expected. Frank used to keep the local country station playing while he worked. Sometimes I'd hear him singing along from the garden. Not very well, mind you, but with enthusiasm. I stood there for a moment letting the memories settle. Then I remembered why I had come. Frank's letter said something was hidden under the floorboards. So I started looking. Now the workshop floor wasn't concrete. It was old wood planks Frank had installed himself years ago. Most of them were dark with age and scratches from tools being dropped. But after a few minutes of looking carefully, one board caught my attention. It was slightly newer than the others. Not by much, but just enough that the color was different. And right beside the board, there was a tiny metal ring screwed into the wood, the kind used to lift a hatch. My heart started beating a little faster. Frank had hidden something here. That much was clear now. Charlie walked over and sniffed the floor like he was trying to help. "All right, boy," I muttered quietly. "Let's see what your old buddy left behind." I knelt down slowly. My knees aren't what they used to be, and grabbed the metal ring. The board lifted easier than I expected. Underneath it was a small wooden compartment, built neatly between the floor beams. Frank had crafted it carefully. The kind of careful work only he would bother with. Inside the compartment sat a black metal lockbox, about the size of a thick dictionary, and taped to the top of it was another note. My hands trembled slightly as I peeled the tape back and unfolded the paper. Frank's handwriting stared back at me again. It said, "Maggie, if you're reading this, then you kept your promise. I'm sorry for what you're about to learn." I swallowed hard and kept reading. "You need to take this box to someone you trust before you open it. Do not show it to Travis. Do not tell anyone from town until you understand what's inside." My chest tightened. Frank had written Travis's name very clearly, which meant one thing. Frank hadn't just been worried about strangers. He had been worried about someone in our own family. The letter ended with one last line, a line that made the entire situation feel heavier. Frank wrote, "Everything you need to understand what happened to me is in that box." I sat there on the barn floor for a long time, holding that lockbox in my hands. The wood creaked softly around me. Charlie lay down nearby, watching me like he always did. The box wasn't very heavy, but somehow it felt like it weighed 100 pounds, because whatever was inside it had been important enough for Frank to hide, important enough for him to warn me, and maybe important enough to explain why my husband had been so afraid during the last weeks of his life. I finally stood up, holding the box against my chest. And as I walked back toward the house, one thought kept circling in my mind. Frank had spent months preparing for something. He had hidden evidence. He had written warnings. And he had made me promise to wait 6 long years before finding it. That meant one thing. Frank believed that whoever he was afraid of might still be watching. Even now, I carried that lockbox back to the house like it was made of glass. Not because it was fragile, but because somehow I knew that whatever was inside it was going to change things, maybe in ways I couldn't undo. Charlie followed right behind me as I climbed the porch steps. The old wood creaked under my feet the same way it always had. Normally that sound comforts me. That day it just reminded me how quiet the house had been since Frank passed. I set the box on the kitchen table, the same table where Frank and I had eaten thousands of meals over the years. The morning sun was shining through the window over the sink, lighting the dust in the air like tiny floating sparks. I sat down and looked at the box. Frank had taped the small note to the top of it. Take this to someone you trust before opening it. Now that's a strange instruction if you think about it. Because when someone tells you not to open something, your curiosity starts screaming. But Frank had never been careless with his words. If he told me not to open it yet, there was a reason. So I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat there thinking, who did I trust enough to bring into this? Not many people, if I'm being honest. Small towns are funny that way. Everybody seems friendly, but news travels faster than a summer thunderstorm. And the last thing I wanted was half of Cedar Ridge whispering about mystery boxes and dead husbands. Charlie climbed under the table and stretched out across my feet like a warm rug. I stared out the window toward the barn. And suddenly one memory popped into my head. Frank's lawyer. His name was Walter Green. Walter had handled our paperwork for years. Property records. Our wills. A few tax issues back when Frank sold a piece of equipment to a company in Arkansas. Walter wasn't flashy or dramatic. He was one of those calm, steady men who listened more than he talked. Frank trusted him. That was good enough for me. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 10:30 in the morning. Walter's office would be open. So I picked up the phone and dialed. Green and Holloway Law Office, a young woman answered. Hello, dear, I said. This is Margaret Whitaker. Is Walter available? There was a short pause. Oh, Mrs. Whitaker. Yes, ma'am, one moment, please. After a few seconds, Walter came on the line. Margaret, he said warmly. It's been a while. How are you holding up these days? I hesitated. Well, Walter, that depends on how you define holding up. He chuckled softly. That doesn't sound promising. I need to see you, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. It's about something Frank left behind. That got his attention. There was a quiet pause on the line. Something related to the estate? He asked. Not exactly, I said slowly. Then I added the one sentence that made the conversation change completely. Frank believed his death might not have been natural. The silence on the other end lasted nearly 10 seconds. Finally, Walter said, Margaret, can you come into the office today? Yes. And bring whatever it is you found. I will. Walter's office sat on the second floor of an old brick building downtown. Cedar Ridge isn't a big town, so downtown really just means 3 blocks with a hardware store, a diner, and a gas station. I locked the house, grabbed my coat, and carried the lockbox out to my car. The drive only took 10 minutes. But my mind didn't slow down once. Frank had hidden this box for a reason. He had warned me about Travis. And he had asked me to involve someone I trusted. That meant whatever was inside was bigger than a family disagreement. Walter greeted me at the door of his office. He looked older than the last time I saw him. More gray hair. Same calm eyes. Margaret, he said gently. Come sit down. His office smelled like paper and coffee. I placed the lockbox carefully on his desk. Walter looked at it for a long moment. Did Frank leave instructions about this? He asked. I handed him the note. He read it slowly. His eyebrows pulled together just slightly. Then he looked up. You haven't opened it yet? No. Good. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. Before we open this, Margaret, I want you to understand something. His voice had changed. It sounded more serious now. If this box contains evidence of wrongdoing, we may need to involve law enforcement. I nodded. I figured as much. Walter studied my face. You're sure you want to do this? I didn't even hesitate. Frank trusted me, I said quietly. That's reason enough. Walter nodded once. Then he reached forward and unlocked the metal clasp on the box. The lid creaked open slowly. Inside were several items. A thick envelope, a small flash drive, a folded map, and a stack of printed documents. Walter picked up the envelope first. It had Frank's handwriting on it. For Maggie. He handed it to me. I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, much longer than the note from the barn. My hands trembled slightly as I started reading. Frank's handwriting was steady, but the words were not. The first sentence made Walter lean forward in his chair. It said, If you're reading this, Maggie, then Travis pushed things farther than I hoped he would. My breath caught in my throat. Walter looked at me. Margaret, he said quietly. What exactly was Frank involved in? I kept reading. And the more I read, the colder the room seemed to feel. Because Frank wasn't just worried about family arguments. He had uncovered something much bigger. Something involving land deals, developers, and a piece of property that Travis had been very interested in. The north field behind the barn. The same land Travis asked about at the funeral. Frank's letter explained something that made my stomach turn. That land had recently been approved for commercial zoning. According to the documents in the box, it was suddenly worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Travis had known about it long before Frank did. I lowered the letter slowly. Walter was already flipping through the printed documents. Then he stopped. His face changed. Margaret, he said carefully, you're going to want to see this. He turned the paper toward me. It was a printed copy of a text message. The sender's name was clear, Travis Whitaker, and the message read, He won't agree to sell. We may have to speed things up. The date on the message was 3 weeks before Frank died. Walter looked up at me slowly. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, but one thing was suddenly very clear. Frank hadn't been imagining things, and whatever had really happened to him was just beginning to come into the light. For a long moment, neither Walter nor I said a word. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the ceiling fan above us. I kept staring at that printed message on the desk. He won't agree to sell. We may have to speed things up. 3 weeks before Frank died. My chest felt tight. Not the kind of tight that comes from panic, but the kind that comes when a terrible possibility finally starts making sense. Walter adjusted his glasses and leaned back slowly in his chair. Well, he muttered under his breath, that's concerning. That was Walter's polite lawyer way of saying this is bad. Real bad. I rubbed my hands together and said quietly, You think Travis meant what it sounds like he meant? Walter didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the lockbox and pulled out the flash drive Frank had left. Let's not guess, he said. Let's see what your husband wanted us to see. Walter slid the flash drive into his computer. The screen flickered for a moment. Then a folder opened. Inside were several files, emails, scanned documents, and something labeled simply, Northfield Project. Walter clicked it. More documents appeared. Maps, property assessments, county zoning approvals. Numbers started jumping out at me immediately. Big numbers. 6 figures. 7 figures. Walter let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. What? I asked. He turned the screen slightly toward me. Margaret, the north field behind your barn isn't just farmland anymore. I leaned forward. What do you mean? Walter tapped the screen. About a year before Frank died, the county quietly approved a commercial expansion zone along Route 19. I blinked. That road runs right past our property. Exactly. He pointed to a highlighted section on the map. Which means your north field suddenly became prime land for development. How much are we talking about? I asked. Walter rubbed his chin. If a shopping center or warehouse company bought that land, he paused. It could easily be worth $700,000. Maybe more. For a second my brain refused to process the number. $700,000. For a field where Frank used to grow hay. That's insane, I whispered. Walter nodded slowly. Yeah, it is. Then he picked up another document. This appraisal here was ordered privately. He scanned the page. Requested by. His eyes lifted toward me. Travis Whitaker. My stomach dropped. So Travis knew about the zoning change? Walter nodded. Looks like he hired a developer from Tulsa to evaluate the land. The name of the company appeared on the screen. Riverbend Development Group. Walter clicked another file. This one was an email chain. The sender again was Travis. The recipient was someone named Kyle Bennett. The subject line read, Acquisition Strategy. Walter's expression darkened as he read. Oh boy. What? I asked. He turned the monitor toward me again. Your stepson was trying to convince this developer that he could get the land cheap once the property transferred to him. My heart started beating faster. But the land never transferred to him. Walter nodded slowly. Nope. Frank's will left everything to you. I sat back in the chair trying to absorb all of it. Travis knew the land was valuable. Frank refused to sell. And then Frank suddenly died. The thought settled into the room like a thundercloud. Walter leaned forward again and opened another file. This one was labeled audio_record. Audio, he muttered. Frank must have recorded something. He clicked play. At first there was just static. Then I heard a voice. Frank's voice. Low, calm, but tense. Maggie, if you ever hear this. My chest tightened immediately. Frank sounded older than I remembered. More tired. Then another voice came through the recording. A younger man. Angry. I knew that voice. Travis. You're being stubborn, Dad, Travis said on the recording. This land is worth serious money now. Frank's voice answered slowly. I'm not selling it. You don't understand what we're dealing with, Travis snapped. I understand just fine, Frank replied. I'm not letting some developer turn this land into a strip mall. The recording crackled slightly. Then Travis said something that made the air in the office feel cold. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Frank's voice stayed steady. Well, son, sometimes doing the right thing is hard. There was a loud scraping noise in the recording, like someone pushing back a chair. Then Travis muttered something under his breath, something I barely caught, but it sounded like, fine, we'll figure something else out. The recording ended. Walter slowly leaned back. Well, he said quietly, now we know your husband wasn't imagining things. My hands were shaking now. Frank had recorded that conversation, which meant one thing. He had been afraid of his own son. I stared at the computer screen for a long time. Walter finally broke the silence. Margaret, did Travis visit the house shortly before Frank died? I nodded slowly. Yes. How long before? Maybe 2 weeks. Walter exhaled through his nose. That lines up almost perfectly with the date on this recording. He rubbed his temple. This is starting to look like something a lot bigger than a family dispute. The room felt colder somehow. Outside the window I could see people walking down Main Street like it was any ordinary day. But suddenly my ordinary life felt very far away. Walter removed the flash drive and set it carefully on the desk. "Margaret," he said gently, "I think it's time we talked to the sheriff." The word sheriff hung in the air. That made everything real. Police meant questions, investigations, maybe even court. I thought about Frank, working in the barn, planting tomatoes, listening to that old radio. Then I remembered something else. Frank had spent months preparing this evidence. He must have known the truth would eventually come out. I looked at Walter and nodded slowly. "All right," I said. "Let's do it." But neither of us realized something yet. Something that would make this whole situation even more dangerous. Because while Walter and I were sitting in that office, looking through Frank's evidence, someone else had already noticed something unusual. And that someone was Travis. And when Travis realized that his father had left proof behind, he wasn't about to sit quietly and let it surface. Not by a long shot. Because sometimes, when people think they're about to lose everything, that's when they start making their biggest mistakes. Walter and I sat there quietly for a moment after listening to that recording. The air in his office felt heavier than before. Not because the room had changed, but because now we both understood something we hadn't wanted to say out loud. Frank had been afraid of his own son. Walter folded his hands on the desk. "Margaret," he said gently, "before we call the sheriff, there's one more thing I'd like to check." "What's that?" I asked. "The rest of these files." He tapped the stack of documents from the lockbox. If Frank collected this much evidence, chances are he kept a timeline of events too. That sounded like Frank. My husband had always been a careful man, the kind who wrote things down. Every tool in the barn had its place. Every bill had its folder. And apparently, every suspicion had its record. Walter flipped through the papers until he found a small spiral notebook. The cover was worn and smudged with grease. Frank's workshop notebook. I recognized it immediately. He used to keep measurements and tool lists in there. Walter opened it carefully. The first few pages were exactly what I expected. Measurements, lumber orders, fence repairs. But halfway through the notebook, the handwriting changed. It became tighter, more serious. And each page started with a date. Walter read the first entry aloud. "May 3rd, Travis called again today about the north field. Told him I'm not selling." He sounded irritated. He flipped the page. "May 19th, Travis brought up developer offer again. Said it would make Maggie and me comfortable for life. I told him comfort isn't everything." Another page. "June 11th, Travis visited in person. Conversation got heated. I recorded it." Walter glanced at me. "That must be the audio file we just heard." He kept turning pages. The entries grew more tense, more worried. Finally Walter reached the last entry. He read it silently at first. Then his expression hardened. "Margaret," he said quietly, "you should hear this one." He cleared his throat and read aloud. "August 7th, Travis came by unexpectedly tonight. Pressured me again about the land. When I refused, he said I was standing in the way of progress. I don't like the way this is going. If something happens to me, Maggie needs to know the truth." Walter slowly closed the notebook. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds, because now it wasn't just suspicion anymore. Frank had documented everything. And the final entry had been written 10 days before he died. Walter leaned back and sighed. "Well, that's enough for the sheriff to at least open an inquiry." My stomach twisted a little. Calling the sheriff meant this wasn't just a family matter anymore. It meant official reports, statements, investigations. But Frank had trusted me with the truth, and that trust mattered more than avoiding trouble. "Call them," I said quietly. Walter nodded and reached for his phone. While he stepped out into the hallway to make the call, I sat alone in the office. The sunlight through the window had shifted slightly. Cars moved slowly along Main Street below. People walking into the diner. A man filling his truck with gas. All of it looked normal. But inside my chest, things didn't feel normal at all. My thoughts kept circling back to Travis. I remembered him as a skinny teenager visiting the house years ago. Frank teaching him how to change a tire. The two of them fishing at the lake. At some point that boy had turned into someone I didn't recognize. Someone willing to pressure his own father for money. And maybe worse. A few minutes later Walter returned. The sheriff's office will send someone by later this afternoon, he said. That quick? I asked. Well, Walter said, evidence tends to speed things up. He tapped the flash drive in the notebook. This is the kind of material investigators like to see. I nodded slowly. Just then, Walter's desk phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID. Then his eyebrows lifted. Well, now that's interesting. Who is it? I asked. Walter turned the phone slightly so I could see the screen. The name displayed there made my heart skip. Travis Whitaker. Walter looked at me. Do you want me to answer? I nodded. Go ahead. Walter pressed the speaker button. Walter Green speaking. Travis's voice came through the phone. Walter. Good. I was hoping to catch you. His tone sounded casual, but there was an edge underneath it. What can I do for you, Travis? Walter asked calmly. Well, Travis said, I heard Margaret stopped by your office this morning. My stomach tightened. How did he know that already? Walter's voice remained steady. Yes, she did. There was a pause on the line. Then Travis said something that made the room go completely still. I just wanted to make sure she's not digging into things that don't concern her. Walter's eyes met mine. His expression didn't change. Travis, he said evenly, Margaret has every right to review her late husband's affairs. Travis laughed softly, but there wasn't any humor in it. Look, Walter, between you and me, Maggie sometimes gets carried away with ideas. I felt a flash of anger rise in my chest. Carried away? Walter's voice cooled slightly. She seems perfectly clear-headed to me. Another pause. Then Travis spoke again. This time slower. Walter, I'd hate for this situation to get messy. Walter leaned forward slightly. What situation would that be? Travis hesitated just long enough to reveal something important. He knew. He knew we had found something. Well, Travis said carefully, family disagreements can turn ugly if outsiders start getting involved. Walter replied calmly, I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to. There was silence for 2 seconds. Then Travis said something that told us everything we needed to know. Just tell Maggie to leave the Northfield alone. My heart pounded. Walter's voice stayed measured. Travis, why exactly are you concerned about that property? The line went quiet. Then Travis muttered something under his breath. And the next thing he said made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Because some things are better left buried. The call ended. Walter slowly set the phone down. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Walter exhaled and said quietly, Well, that right there is what detectives call a bad sign. I nodded slowly, because Travis had just confirmed something without meaning to. He wasn't surprised we were looking into the land. He wasn't confused. He was worried. And worried people start making mistakes. About 20 minutes later, Walter's secretary knocked on the office door. There's someone here to see you, she said. Walter glanced at me. That was quick. But when the door opened, the man who stepped inside wasn't the sheriff. And the look on his face told me something was already going very wrong. Because standing there in the doorway was Travis. Now, honey, this is the part where things stopped feeling like just a sad mystery and started feeling like something dangerous was finally waking up. Because when Walter Green called me 4 days later, His voice didn't sound normal. It was lower than usual. Slower. Careful, like every word had to be weighed before it came out. He said, "Mrs. Whitaker, I think you need to come into my office." I asked him straight, "Walter, is it bad?" There was a pause. Then he said, "It's serious. Very serious. And let me tell you something about getting older, sweetheart. When lawyers start using words like serious instead of just telling you plain, it usually means your life is about to take a turn you didn't ask for." So that Thursday morning I drove into town. Same old county roads. Same rusty stop signs bending in the wind. Same quiet little Missouri town that always acted like nothing bad could ever happen there. But that day, everything felt off. Like the air was holding its breath. Walter Green's office sat above a small insurance shop downtown. When I walked in, his secretary gave me that look. Soft eyes. Slow voice. Like she already knew my morning was about to get heavier. She said, "Mrs. Whitaker, he's expecting you." Inside his office were two men, Walter Green, and a detective I had never met before. A tall man in a dark coat, badge clipped on his belt. He stood up immediately. "Detective Mark Holloway," he said. "County Sheriff's Office." My stomach tightened right there. Because Sheriff's Office doesn't show up for polite conversations. They show up when things are already broken. I sat down slowly. Walter opened a folder on his desk. Inside were printed messages. Text conversations. Hundreds of them. Between Travis Whitaker and a man named Victor Langston, a real estate developer from Columbus. The kind of man who smiles in meetings but calculates everything in dollars. Walter slid the papers toward me, and I started reading. One message said, "Once zoning clears, the property value jumps above $650K. Another said, "The old man is refusing to sell." My eyes moved faster now, and then I saw it. A message from Travis. Short. Cold. "He's not cooperating. I may need to escalate things." I looked up. My hands were shaking just a little now. "Escalate," I whispered. Detective Holloway watched me closely. "We believe your husband discovered these communications," he said. Walter nodded toward the table. "That's likely why he created the hidden compartment." And that's when I saw the USB drive sitting there. 3 small pieces of plastic. But they didn't feel small. They felt heavy. Like they were holding something that had been waiting a long time to come out. The detective said quietly, "There's more." He handed me another document. Bank transfers. Large sums. Going from Victor Langston's company to an account tied to Travis Whitaker. Labeled as consulting. But nobody in that room needed a dictionary to understand what that really meant. Money moving quietly. Like instructions without words. I swallowed hard. "You're saying, Travis." I couldn't finish. Walter leaned forward. "We're saying your husband may have been under extreme pressure before his death." Then he added something else. Something that made my chest go tight. The cardiologist he was seeing. He placed another sheet down. "Dr. Samuel Keene." I frowned. "That's the doctor Travis recommended." The detective nodded. "Exactly." And suddenly everything started connecting in a way that made my skin feel cold. Travis pushes the doctor. Doctor reinforces stress. Land pressure increases. Arguments grow. Calls get sharper. Visits get tense. And then one day, Frank collapses in the kitchen. Heart attack. That's what the report said. But Detective Holloway looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "Mrs. Whitaker, there are ways to kill a man without ever touching him." Silence filled the room after that. Heavy silence. The kind that sits on your shoulders. Walter closed the folder gently. "We're upgrading this to a formal investigation." The detective added, "We'll be pulling financial records, phone data, everything." Then he looked at me directly. And Mrs. Whitaker. You need to be careful now. I blinked. Careful. He nodded slowly. If Travis suspects you have those drives, he may try to stop you from continuing. And that sentence, that one sentence, landed in my chest like a stone, because I finally understood. This wasn't just about land. It wasn't even just about money. This was about truth coming out after being buried for years. And truth makes guilty people desperate. Walter walked me to the door. Before I left, he said softly, "You've done the right thing, Margaret." I nodded. But as I drove home that afternoon, I kept checking my rearview mirror. Just once. Then again. Because for the first time since Frank died, it felt like I wasn't alone anymore. And 2 nights later, Travis Whitaker showed up at my house. Uninvited. Angry. And what he said standing on my porch. Well, honey, that's where everything started to crack wide open. Now listen here, sweetheart. After Walter said those words about truth making guilty people desperate, I drove home with my hands tight on the steering wheel the whole way. Even Charlie, my old golden retriever, noticed something was wrong the second I walked through the door. He didn't even wag his tail. Just watched me like he already knew trouble was walking right behind me. I kept Frank's lockbox on the kitchen table. Didn't move it. Didn't hide it. At that point, hiding it wouldn't have changed anything anymore. Because once powerful people think you're standing in their way, they don't wait politely. The sun had barely started setting over Cedar Ridge when I heard it. A truck. Slow. Heavy. Rolling down Maple Hollow Lane like it owned the road. Charlie stood up instantly. Low growl in his chest. That's when I knew. I didn't need to look out the window. I already knew who it was. Travis Whitaker. Frank's son. My stepson. The same man whose name had been all over those messages. I walked to the front porch slowly. Not because I was brave, but because at 76 you don't run from your own story anymore. You meet it where it shows up. The truck stopped right in front of the house. Headlights still on. Engine running. Then the door opened. And Travis stepped out. He didn't look like the boy I remembered from years ago. No, sir. This man looked tired but sharp. Anger sitting right under his skin like it had been waiting for days. He shut the truck door hard. Then called out, "Margaret." No respect in his voice. No warmth either. Just pressure. I stood on the porch railing and said calmly, "Evening, Travis." He laughed once. Short. Cold. "Don't evening me. We need to talk." Charlie moved beside me now, growling louder. Travis glanced at him. "Keep that dog back." I didn't move. "What do you want, Travis?" That's when his tone changed. Just slightly. Like a door creaking open. "I know you went to Walter Green." My stomach tightened a little, but I kept my face still. "And," I said. Travis stepped closer to the porch. Not rushing. Just confident. Like he believed this was already his. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he said quietly. I looked at him right in the eyes. "I understand my husband left me something." That made his jaw tighten. For a second, just a second, I saw something crack in his expression. Not guilt. Not sadness. Something closer to fear. He lowered his voice. Frank didn't know what he was getting into. I shook my head slowly. "No, Travis." He knew exactly what he was doing. That hit him harder than he expected. I could tell. Because his eyes shifted toward the house. Like he was measuring something inside it. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You should have left it alone." The air went still. Even the crickets stopped for a moment. Charlie's growl deepened. I stepped forward slightly. "My husband died," I said. "My husband left me a letter saying he may not have died naturally." Travis's face hardened instantly. "Stop saying things like that." His voice rose now. Anger slipping through. "You think this is some kind of game?" I nodded slowly. No, Travis. This is my life. That's when he reached into his jacket pocket. I won't lie to you. My heart jumped right up into my throat. But he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a phone and turned the screen toward me. It was a photo. A scanned copy of Frank's barn floor. The hidden compartment. My chest tightened immediately. How did you? I started. Travis cut me off. I've known about that box longer than you think. Silence. Heavy silence. Then he added, and I know what's inside it. That's when everything inside me went cold. Because Walter hadn't even finished going through everything yet. So how did Travis already know? Unless someone told him. Or worse, someone was watching. I stepped back slightly onto the porch. Stay where you are, I said firmly. Travis shook his head. You don't get it, Margaret. His voice dropped again. Almost calm now. This isn't just about land anymore. I frowned. Then what is it about? He looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, survival. That word sat between us like a stone. Before I could answer, a second set of headlights turned onto Maple Hollow Lane. A sheriff's car. Slow. Controlled. Pulling right up behind Travis's truck. The door opened, and Detective Holloway stepped out, hand already near his belt. Mr. Whitaker, he called out firmly. I suggest you step away from the house. Travis didn't move right away. He just looked at me, long and hard, like he was trying to decide something. Then he said softly, this isn't over. And for the first time, I believed him, because as he slowly backed toward his truck, I noticed something in his hand, a small black object, not a phone, not a wallet, something else. And before I could even process it, he dropped it onto my porch step, then got into his truck and drove off without another word. Dust rising behind him like a warning. The sheriff moved quickly toward my porch. Mrs. Whitaker, he said sharply, did he threaten you? I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the object he left behind. Walter arrived moments later, almost out of breath. When he saw what was on the porch, his face changed completely. Don't touch that, he said immediately. My voice went quiet. What is it? Walter swallowed hard, then said the words I was not ready to hear. That looks like a recording device. And suddenly, I understood something terrifying. Travis hadn't come here just to scare me. He had come here to listen, to see what I knew, to find out how much Frank had really left behind. The sheriff carefully picked it up using gloves. Walter turned to me. Margaret. He knows we're close. I looked down at Frank's lockbox sitting on my kitchen table through the open door. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt it. Not just fear, but urgency. Because whatever Frank had uncovered was still active, still dangerous. And someone out there did not want the rest of it to come out. Not now. Not ever. And that night on Maple Hollow Lane, I finally realized something very important. The truth wasn't just buried in the barn anymore. It was standing right outside my door. That night, nobody slept in Cedar Ridge. Not me. Not Walter Green. And certainly not the sheriff's department. Because once that recording device was taken off my porch, everything shifted from suspicion to something far more dangerous, something official, something active. Walter came back to my house just after midnight. His car headlights cut across the yard like searchlights. Charlie barked once, then went silent again the moment he saw Walter step out. That alone told me how serious things had become. Walter didn't even sit down at first. He just stood in my kitchen, looking at Frank's lockbox like it might explode. Finally, he said, Margaret, we've got a problem. I held my breath. What kind of problem? He placed a sealed evidence bag on the table. Inside it was the device Travis had dropped on my porch. And? I asked. Walter exhaled slowly. It wasn't just a recorder. My stomach tightened. What was it then? He looked at me directly. A live transmitter. For a second I didn't understand. Then he clarified. It was still sending audio. My mouth went dry. You mean? Walter nodded. Everything we said tonight could have been heard in real time. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too quiet. Even the ticking clock sounded louder. Charlie stood up again, uneasy. Walter continued. The sheriff's office traced the signal before it cut out. And his expression hardened. It was bouncing through a private network. That word hit me harder than it should have. Private networks don't belong to small-town arguments. They belong to people who know how to stay hidden. Walter opened his folder again. This is where things get complicated. He slid another set of papers across the table. Financial transfers, emails, and new names I didn't recognize. But one name appeared again and again. Victor Langston, the developer. Only now, there was something new added beside his name. A legal consulting firm, based in another state, with ties to land acquisitions across multiple counties. Walter tapped the paper. Margaret, this isn't just about your farm anymore. My voice came out low. Then what is it about? He hesitated, then said, your husband didn't just uncover a land deal. He uncovered a pattern. That word made my skin tighten. Pattern means repetition. And repetition means this wasn't the first time something like this happened. Walter leaned forward. Frank found evidence that properties were being quietly pushed into forced sales. Pressure tactics. Legal manipulation. Medical influence. I frowned. Medical. Walter nodded grimly. Doctors being encouraged to assess stress conditions in elderly landowners. My hands went cold. Then I remembered Frank's last months. The anxiety. The sleepless nights. The doctor visits Travis helped arrange. It wasn't random anymore. It was arranged. Carefully. Quietly. Deliberately. Walter continued. And once a property becomes medically compromised. He paused. It becomes easier to challenge ownership. Silence filled the room. Heavy. Pressing. Then Walter said the final part. The North Field wasn't the target. I looked up sharply. What do you mean? He pointed to the map. There are 6 more properties in this county alone that match the same pattern. My breath caught. 6. Frank hadn't just stumbled into a family conflict. He had stepped into something structured, organized, and dangerous. Walter lowered his voice. And Frank, he documented all of it. I looked at the lockbox. My husband hadn't just left me memories. He had left me proof of something bigger than Cedar Ridge. Something that reached far beyond our barn. Just then, the sheriff called Walter. We could hear his voice through the speaker. Walter, we've got a situation. Walter straightened immediately. What kind of situation? A pause. Then the sheriff said something that made the room go silent. We just got confirmation. Travis Whitaker left town. My heart dropped. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again slowly. Did he take anything? He asked. Another pause. Then the sheriff replied, yes, a second storage device. Walter looked at me immediately, and I already understood. Frank hadn't only hidden one copy of the truth. He had prepared for exactly this. Walter turned to me. Margaret, do you know if Frank ever mentioned a second hiding place? I sat very still, thinking, remembering. Frank wasn't just careful. He was methodical. Then suddenly, a memory surfaced. Not of the barn, not of the house, but of something he once said casually while fixing the fence. If anything ever happens to me, Maggie, don't trust just one place. Truth needs backup. I stood up slowly. I think I know where it is. Walter's eyes widened slightly. Where? I looked toward the dark window, toward the barn in the distance, and I said quietly, somewhere Travis never thought to look. Walter didn't say a word for a full minute, just stood there in my kitchen, staring at me like he was trying to decide whether I was guessing or remembering something real. Then he finally asked, "Are you sure, Margaret?" I nodded slowly. "I'm sure enough to go look." That was the thing about Frank Whitaker. He didn't leave puzzles for fun. He left instructions like he knew the world might turn on him one day. And right now it looked like he was right. We didn't wait for morning. Walter called the sheriff again. Within 30 minutes, Detective Holloway was back at my house. This time he didn't come alone. 2 patrol cars parked down the lane with their lights off, quiet, careful. No sirens. No attention. Just presence. Like they were already expecting something ugly. Charlie stayed close to me the whole time. Not barking now. Just alert. Watching. Detective Holloway stepped inside and said, "Mrs. Whitaker, if there's another location we need to move fast." Walter added. And quietly. The detective nodded. That's already understood. We drove in 2 vehicles. Mine stayed behind. Walter and I went with the sheriff. The barn sat in the dark like it always did. But tonight it didn't feel like a memory. It felt like a checkpoint. Like something had been waiting there the entire time. Charlie refused to stay in the house. He jumped into Walter's car before anyone could stop him. Nobody argued. At this point, even the dog felt like part of the truth. Inside the barn, everything looked exactly the same as before. Tools. Dust. Old wood. That radio Frank used to play. But I wasn't looking at what was visible anymore. I was looking at what Frank would have considered safe. Frank never trusted obvious hiding places. He always went deeper. Under things. Behind things. Or inside things that looked ordinary. I walked slowly toward the back wall of the workshop. Charlie followed close, sniffing low near the floor. Then he stopped, right near an old metal cabinet Frank used for paint cans. He scratched once at the ground, then looked at me. Walter stepped forward. "You think it's here?" I knelt down, and that's when I noticed it. The cabinet wasn't fully touching the ground, just slightly lifted, like something underneath it wasn't level. My heart started beating faster. "This wasn't here before," I whispered. Walter helped me shift the cabinet carefully. It scraped against the floor with a heavy sound, and underneath was a sealed wooden panel, different from the rest. Newer. Reinforced. Frank had built it into the structure itself. Detective Holloway crouched down beside it. "There's a latch," he said. A small hidden metal ring was embedded into the wood. Just like the first one, but smaller, more hidden. Walter looked at me. "Ready?" I swallowed. "What does that mean?" Walter didn't answer right away. He opened the second lockbox carefully. Inside were documents far more detailed than the first set. Maps across multiple counties, names of landowners, patterns highlighted in red ink, and repeated signatures of one consulting group. Langston Advisory Group. Detective Holloway leaned in. "This is statewide." Walter nodded slowly. "At least." My chest felt tight. Frank hadn't just been watching Cedar Ridge. He had been tracing something bigger. Something organized. Something that didn't rely on one person like Travis. The detective flipped another page. "Margaret, look at this." I leaned closer. It was a list. Dozens of properties, and next to each one, a status note. Medical pressure initiated. Ownership instability increased. Sale likely. My stomach turned. Walter, this one, still had something left to say. Something Frank never got to finish. And if Travis was really coming back, then we didn't have much time left before the truth finally met the people it was meant to expose. Or destroy. That night didn't feel like a normal night in Cedar Ridge anymore. It felt like the whole town was holding its breath. Because when Travis Whitaker showed up at my porch uninvited, standing under that yellow porch light, I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to control the story. I opened the door just a little. Not all the way. Charlie, my old golden retriever, stood right behind me this time. Low growl in his throat like even he understood danger before I did. Travis forced a smile. "Hey, Maggie," he said softly like nothing was wrong. "We need to talk." I didn't move. "About what, Travis?" His eyes flicked past me, toward the house like he was searching for something. "You've been speaking to Walter Green," he said. Not a question. Fact. My heart didn't race. It slowed. That's what fear does when it turns into clarity. "I've been handling your father's estate," I replied calmly. "That's all." Travis stepped 1 foot closer. "Then stop digging," he said quietly. And there it was. No mask anymore. No polite son of a lawyer voice. Just pressure. Cold and sharp. I looked him straight in the eye. "No," I said. That was it. One word. But it changed everything. Travis's jaw tightened. For a second I thought he might step inside. But then, a second set of headlights appeared behind him on the gravel road. Then another. And another. Red and blue lights flashed across the trees. Police cars. 3 of them. Travis turned slowly. And for the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Fear. Detective Mark Holloway stepped out first. Calm. Professional. "Travis Whitaker," he called out. "Step away from the property." Travis laughed nervously. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're making a mistake." But no one moved. Walter Green stood near the porch steps now too, holding a folder. And I realized something in that moment. This wasn't random. This was planned. The investigation had already reached its final stage. Detective Holloway raised a hand. "Mr. Whitaker," he said firmly, "we have bank records, recorded conversations, and digital evidence linking you to coercion, financial manipulation, and interference in a vulnerable elderly patient." Travis's face changed. Just slightly. Like the ground under him had disappeared. "That's not," he started. But the detective cut him off. "Also, your phone messages with the developer have been verified." Silence. Even the crickets outside seemed quieter. Then Walter Green stepped forward and said something I'll never forget. "Travis, your father documented everything." That hit him harder than anything else. Because money he could argue. Evidence he could twist. But Frank's voice. Frank's notes. Frank's truth. That he couldn't erase. Travis looked at me. For a second, just a second. He wasn't angry. He looked lost. Like a man realizing too late that the ground he built his life on wasn't solid. Then he whispered. I didn't mean for it to go that far. But it was too late for that sentence. Far too late. Detective Holloway stepped forward. Travis Whitaker, you are under arrest. The handcuffs clicked. That sound echoed more than anything else that night. Charlie stopped growling. The porch light flickered slightly in the wind. And I just stood there, watching the man I once saw as family being led away. The trial came fast. Small towns don't like waiting when truth finally breaks loose. Everything Frank left behind became the center of the case. The recordings, the messages, the bank transfers, the notebook. Every piece fit together like a puzzle Frank had been assembling quietly, even before he died. And when the verdict finally came, the courtroom was silent. Travis Whitaker was found guilty on multiple charges related to financial coercion, obstruction of investigation, and unlawful influence over estate property. He was sentenced to 17 years in state prison. No early exit. No quiet settlement. No slipping away. Just consequences. Real ones. The kind you can't talk your way out of. After the trial, Walter and I walked out of the courthouse together. The air outside felt different, lighter, like something heavy had finally lifted. Walter looked at me and said softly, "Frank did good." I nodded. "Yeah," I whispered. "He really did." But I wasn't thinking about revenge or punishment. I was thinking about a man who loved his wife enough to prepare for a truth he knew he might never see himself. A man who built silence into evidence and patience into justice. A week later, I went back to the barn. Charlie walked beside me like always. The floorboards where I found the lockbox were still there. Nothing looked different, but everything felt different. I stood there for a long time. Then I said quietly, "You did it, Frank." And for the first time in years, I smiled, because the truth wasn't buried anymore. It was finally free. And as I closed the barn door behind me, I realized something powerful. Some secrets don't stay hidden forever. And some people, like Travis Whitaker, eventually answer for everything they tried to bury. Thank you for watching and spending your time with this story. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.